Welcome to this morning's GNCC Espresso Live. My name is Mishka Balsom and I will be your moderator for the next hour. Our current times have amplified the long-standing challenges faced by women both socially and economically, and we have all seen it, the pressing and immediate needs that have emerged during this crisis. Last month, Niagara Community Observatory released a report on gender representation and governance in our region. Women make up the majority of the population in Niagara, yet this is not reflected in the number of women on municipal councils or advisory committees and boards. This disparity matters because the discussions taking place and the policy decisions being made can best help everyone in the community when those at the decision-making table truly reflect the diversity of its population. We have gathered this morning to review the results of the report and to discuss their impact on our community, as well as looking to see if there are any actionable solutions at the community level here in Niagara. To address some of these questions that we have and some of the results from the report, we are fortunate to be joined this morning by the two authors of the report, Dr. Carol Phillips, Research Coordinator with Niagara Community Observatory, a public policy think tank working in partnership with the Niagara community to foster, produce, and disseminate research on current and emerging issues. And Dr. Sarah Pennisi, Director of Brock University Student Wellness and Accessibility Center and a founding member of Niagara's Gender Equity Task Force. As well, we have with us Diana Huson, Regional Councillor for the Town of Pelham, Chair for the Planning and Economic Development Standing Committee, and Chair of the Niagara Region's Women's Advisory Committee. Ladies, thank you very much for being with us this morning. For this webinar, we have also agreed, rather than addressing each other by title, we all agreed that first name basis might make it actually a better dialogue. So thank you for agreeing to that. Just a quick few housekeeping items as we're moving forward. So for today's format, we would like it to really be a highly interactive one. Currently, all attendees and participants are on mute, but we want to encourage the interaction. So there's two options that are available to you. The first one is the raise hand function on Zoom. It's the best way for us to see that you want to say something. And what we will do is you will see that we will unmute you on our end, and that way you can ask your question live directly to any one of our panelists. And the second option available to you is the chat function. It's a field where you can type in the question, and please know that all the panelists on our end here, we see the questions and we'll make sure that we get to all of them. And over the last week, while we promoted this particular webinar, we've had a high influx of people from the community actually providing us and submitting some questions because they might have not or might not be able to join us this morning. So we'll try our best to get through all of them. But before we start out, I thought maybe I'm going to start out with you, Sarah, and just asking you what brought this particular idea forward. And you were the one who reached out to Carol in the Niagara Community Observatory to saying, like, maybe there's a potential report here. Sarah, over to you. What was the essence of what brought this about?
Thank you, Mishka. So yes, as you mentioned, I, along with a group of 3 other women, including you, started a conversation in April around gender equity in Niagara and what we could do to support local politicians and local policy makers to apply a gender lens when developing and implementing policy. And so Carol and I know each other from Brock University, and I reached out to Carol, and Carol was very excited about this opportunity and this discussion as well. And that's where the idea started. It was a conversation that we had around what does the landscape look like in Niagara and how could we work together to highlight locally what gender equity looks like as a starting point in conversation.
I appreciate that. And yes, for full disclosure, actually Sarah and I are on the same committee. It's called the Niagara's Gender Equity Task Force and have been on it for the last year and a half. So I think it's always good to understand what the basis of a particular report was, what triggered it actually and triggered the discussion and moving forward. And then Carol, over to you. You worked on the report with your staff. Can you let us know a little bit about how you went about the report, and maybe maybe between you and Sarah can give us an idea what some of the key findings of the report were?
Sure. So, as you know, when I met with your group, the question was how do you quantify gender equity? So the very first step and the easiest step was to, well, let's see how many councillors we have elected, and we can go from there. That's a very easy thing to do. And I think what I also wanted to do was take it a step further and see if women were participating on these advisory committees, because of course then that eliminates the whole need to campaign, to put your name out there, to go through an electoral process. So for me, that was the more interesting part. I know everybody wants to talk about female representation on elected councils. For me, I was interested to see, are women participating more at the committee level? So what we found, of course, was that at the elected level, Niagara has about 27% women in their elected positions across the region, at the regional level and at all the 12 municipalities. It averages out to 27%. And at the committee level, the advisory committee level, which are appointed citizens, we find 45% of those positions are held by women. So that was the whole kind of founding numbers of then what led us to discuss, well, why might this be happening? What else can we do to improve the situation? And why is it important?
Yes, well, that is a real critical question. Diana, when you saw and read the report, you looked at the results. Any surprises on your end as a politician, as a woman in this field?
I don't think so. I think we knew that women were underrepresented in governance structures in Niagara and even outside of Niagara. But it highlighted the importance of having more voices of women present in terms of informing our policy making, because as you mentioned earlier, women do actually represent 51% of our population. So if we were to reflect on that, we need enough voices at the table that can truly ensure that our policies are reflective of our communities, and that means better policy, more effective policy, and better communities.
Carol, if I can go back to you for one question. It's like Niagara is made up of 12 municipalities and one regional government. Did we see a significant difference between and among the municipalities when we looked at it, when it comes to, and I'm really sorry to put you on the spot.
I know. That was not on our list. That was not on our list of questions, but yes, I did break it down. Yeah. The report does break it down. So when you're looking at, let me see, let me find my committees. I think the committees were, we know who our female mayors are, Sandra Easton and Betty in Niagara on the Lake. So committee-wise, all right, let's see here. The people, the councils, or rather the towns that had the majority actually of women on their committees, Fort Erie had 52% of their committee positions female. Grimsby had 59.4%. And Waynfleet actually had 59%. So, actually, I forgot this. West Lincoln actually came out #1. They had 74.1% of their committee positions were held by women. I just want to say, though, I mean, it's great to see nobody was, I mean, the lowest we're looking in maybe the low 30s, the low 30% for participation on these appointed committees. So no one's doing poorly. What I found really interesting when I looked on these committees, what they were for, their subject matter, that's where you saw a big difference, right? So for instance, and in both ways, like I saw a transportation committee that when I looked at the numbers last December 2019, were all men. There were no women on this transportation committee. And then I looked at an age-friendly committee and they were all women. So, you know, that to me was more interesting. And then a lot of the time where you're seeing, you saw a lot of kind of 70-30, 60-40 going on, right? So for the most part, I mean, there was only 2 or 3 committees 3 or 4 maybe where I saw a real, wow, guys, you had to make a better effort to get somebody from the other gender on there, right? And I know sometimes there are clerks that realize that. For instance, I don't want to call them out, but West Lincoln, because they're doing so well when it comes to gender representation, it was actually their age-friendly committee that at the time had only women on it. And I happened to be chatting with the clerk about that, and they said because of that, they had actually invited, they had some male members who dropped off the committee, so they invited a couple of men to sit on as guests because they realized that was an issue. I myself sit on an advisory committee, and I'm the only female on it. And that's actually why I'm more passionate about the whole committee level than I am about the elected level. Just because I found it's an active transportation committee. And I found we were talking a lot about bike lanes and bike trails, and we just had a snowstorm. And I was watching women with their strollers struggling to walk to school. Walking to get their kids to school. So I kind of brought that up at the next meeting, but you know, it's just the path of least resistance is still the bike paths and the repair stations and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think I digressed from the original question, but you know, no one's doing poorly. Some are doing noticeably better than others, right? And at the committee level, I think that's really, I know I'm getting ahead of ourselves here. The committee level really is where you can control things more than you can at an elected level, right? I mean, you can have as many female candidates as you can get, but at the committee level, you can really say, okay, we need to make sure that committee has more than one person of that particular gender, right? So.
And I think, Kelly, making an interesting and important differentiation, because we're looking at committees and boards and the participation at that level versus elected politicians. And Sarah, as a co-author of this report, what causes the lack of representation for women locally when we look at the elected political public sector of it? Is it something that arises because we are a series of small communities? What drives this? When you look at the results, any indication there for the reason of that level of the discrepancy in representation?
Well, I think one of the things that we noted in the report is there are real practical things that can get in the way of inviting other people to dialogue. So the real practical things, you know, building on what Carol said, is transportation, right? So, and who uses public transportation more often is those underrepresented groups. So racialized communities, women, people living in poverty. And so I think in Niagara, when we compare ourselves to other communities, we really need to pay attention to those structural assets that either get in the way for people to participate or facilitate that to happen. And, you know, in the context of COVID-19, with a lot of stuff going virtual, even the technical divide in terms of access to the internet and to the computer, that can also facilitate conversation, dialogue, and inclusion, or it can get in the way. So I think it actually makes sense that, and that's what we were hoping for from the report, that we start examining the ways that we conduct business, the way that we assume people can engage, and then really pay attention to whether they are meeting the intended purpose or not. Because I think that's one of the fundamental questions of the report as well, is that policy is designed with a specific intention, but unless you engage the people that you are intending to support, benefit, engage, then you may miss the mark. Businesses are run that way. I know I lead my team with customers in mind. And unless you pay attention to what your customer is saying, you're not going to be on the mark when it comes to matching your intention and the outcome. So really in Niagara, I think paying attention to what resources and assets are available to support that type of engagement, and what makes us different than other adjacent communities like Hamilton, for example, if we want to start comparing ourselves to others, and then really paying attention to how might we mitigate the things that are getting in the way so that our conversation can be more inclusive.
I really appreciate. Yeah, Carol, you were about to say.
No, I just pulled up the paper. Our report goes into detail about who is, has more women than, who has as many women versus men. So for instance, Fort Erie has 3 female councillors and 4 male. And I think as I go down the list that they're probably doing the best. And when I talk about West Lincoln, who has such good female representation on their appointed committees, they actually only have 1 female councillor and 6 male councillors. So they're not doing so well at the elected level, but at the appointed level, they're doing quite well. So.
And Diana, as an elected official, you work with your colleagues across Niagara for the last couple of years. What is your take on it, your perspective of what causes the lack of representation for women locally at that elected level?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, so I think there is a number of factors. Some of it is systematic in terms of, the difference in how we bring up boys and girls differently, and emphasizing, attention and taking on a leadership role and trying to stand out. I think that girls are somewhat discouraged from taking on those roles, where boys are encouraged to take on those roles. But it also leads to, the unequal division of family labor, where women are typically taking on more of the unpaid work. They're often also caring for a loved elderly relative. There's also cultural attitudes about gender roles and what role a woman has in either the home versus the workplace or the leadership. There's also the nature of politics. Politics can be adversarial. It's both a work style and a communication style that I think women are not attracted to. They prefer more of a collaborative and open communicative style. So that can be discouraging. And then there's also what we've seen recently with some online harassment that really makes you question, is it worth taking on a position that has, you really can't, at least in Niagara, we're not full-time politicians, so this is a part-time job. But is it worth the hassle of the online scrutiny and the loss of the private aspect of your life to take on a part-time job, right? So, and for me, I love my community. I want to make things better in my community, and I see this as the best way that I can participate in that. And there's been a lot of momentum in terms of talking about women's issues and bringing women's issues forward. And we did see an improvement. Just if we speak about regional council, we are at about 25% representation right now. In the previous council, we only had 13%. And there was 13% representation of women. So I think that goes to the importance of speaking about these issues and bringing attention to why they're important. And I think we will see results. And even for myself, I ran in the town of Pelham. I actually found out while I was campaigning that in 2018, I was the first female candidate who had ever put their name on the ballot. And I was completely shocked about that. So I think we need, we need women to be comfortable in taking on those roles. I think we need to speak up when there's inappropriate behavior or unprofessional behavior and demand more of public officials in the way that they are treated. And I think all of those things will go towards a more positive environment for women to participate in politics.
One of the things that often has been mentioned is that actually communities need to offer more workshops and more support to help women to persuade them to run for office in the first place. And like you said, how to get to the point of getting your name on the ballot, even that part of it, because I think there's 2 aspects to it. First of all, we have to encourage people to run for the position. And secondly, we have to also create awareness among voters. To maybe expect a different style of communication if dependent on the candidates and that are coming forward. But Diana, on that note, this was your first time running for politics. Was there support for you available, or are you aware that if there is support, workshops or other things that are available for women who are interested in running for office? I know we have a council internally at the Greater Niagara Chamber of Commerce called the WIN Council, who has partners as Women in Niagara. They have partnered actively with the City of St. Catharines for some funding to encourage and support women to provide them with the skills, the necessary skills for them to put their name on the ballot as being a really initial step of it. But is there anything that you are aware of that maybe our attendees might be interested in knowing about?
Well, and there was an effort previous to the last municipal election, and I attended some of those sessions. So that goes towards helping to, you know, that helped encourage me to think about putting my name on the ballot. And thankfully I did, because it ended up being a positive experience for me. But I'm not aware of anything at the moment. I will say that I actually was successful in putting a motion forward to create a women's advisory committee. I believe this is one of the things that we're going to be looking at, is that how can we create more opportunities for women to take on leadership roles and engage more in civic life. There was the Seat at the Table program at St. Catharines. I think that's a program that at the regional level that we'll be looking at in terms of, is that something that we can duplicate and help bring those messages to people across Niagara. So I think there is more to come. And I would ask everyone to stay tuned and pay attention to that committee, because I think we're going to have some really great initiatives for women in Niagara.
I agree with you. And I just want to make every participant here aware too, if you have any questions about any groups that you might be interested in, please feel free to contact us. We have our Women in Niagara Council that has an extensive list of groups that might actually support your wishes of going into running for public office. There's also a Niagara Facebook group. It's called Women in Municipal Government, Women in, I believe is actually, I'm going to share it with the group in a second, or we share it as a follow-up to it. But it's in support of women in politics, and specifically in municipal politics too in Niagara. So there's an active Facebook group as well. But there are some resources and groups that are providing resources that might be worthwhile tapping into. But Carol, I wanted to come back to you on something. And one of the questions that has come forward to us from the community has been, how typical is Niagara when it comes to women in politics and other leadership roles? How do we fare?
Well, there was a municipal study done across Canada early this year. The study would have taken place last year, but it was published earlier this year by the Canadian Municipal Barometer project. And they showed that across Canada, women made up about 31.5% of elected municipal positions. So we're a little below that Canadian average. At the provincial level, so if you're looking at the provincial legislature, there's almost 40% female representation. At the federal level in Parliament, there's about 26% federal representation women have. So we're not too far off, but we're below the national average, it looks like, anyways, at the municipal level. Again, not a lot of study has been done municipally around the world. A lot of the numbers we're looking at always look at the national parliaments to see what gender representation is there. I believe is the global average for parliamentary representation, I want to say 24%. So that's where women are these days. It looks like we're stuck around the 30%-ish, 25 to 30% mark, quite a bit. Ontario, for some reason, as a province, is bucking that trend in its provincial legislature. I don't know why. That would be a great reason to do some further research, as we like to say.
Mishka, can I add to that?
Yeah.
I just want to talk, I mean, it is important to look at numbers and in terms of reflecting the representation, but it's equally as important to talk about why that representation is important. And if we look at Niagara, we know that, 79% of our single parents are female in Niagara. So think about how childcare policy impacts that group of our population. In addition to that, 62.3% of women rely on public transportation as their primary mode of transportation. So public transit and transportation networks is an important to look at through a gender lens. And then in addition to that, it's 65% of our 85 plus population are female, and 79% of our widowed population are female. So when we think about delivering senior services, we know that it's predominantly women who are the recipients of these services. So it makes sense. And going back to what Sarah says, if this was a business, we would recognize that that is our target market, and we would reflect the decisions we made based on delivering the best services to that group that's using those services. And I think that government needs to really look at that the same way.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And similar statistics, the Facebook group, the Niagara Women in Politics, brought forward as well. There was another interesting aspect of it too. So the ones that you brought up, Diana, the things that you brought up, Carol, and there were also aspects of that almost spoke to character too. And there have been some studies done. For example, it costs us to run a campaign. And do women have the same amount of flexibility when looking at their jobs with the time to campaign as maybe some others have? And in many cases, they found they have less flexibility because of the other demands that were on them to be able actually to exercise that aspect of it. So it's a complex issue, which I think brings a high number of things forward. But Diana, one of the things that you have brought up is actually the harassment that in many cases the female elected officials are facing. It happens in Niagara. We are not immune to it. It happens across the country. We have read and seen a lot about that in the news over the last year or two. I think the awareness is increasing on that. Is that one of the great deterrents for someone to run for political office? What's your take on it, Diana?
Well, definitely nobody likes to be harassed, and why would you put yourself in a position to invite that type of harassment? But I think, we maybe as a society, we have to do a better job in terms of calling that out. And I agree, increasing awareness is one aspect of it, but we have to step up and say, this is inappropriate. We need to act better than this, and it is a problem. I hope it doesn't discourage some women, because we've got some really great, smart, intelligent women, hardworking women who want to contribute in this space, and it's really important to have their voices there.
And if I might add to that, Mishka, so I think it's, a cultural shift is something that we can do through education and through dialogue. But I think looking at the policy levers that exist to kind of greatly encourage, if not force, a change in behavior would be looking at legislation that right now is not really that clear when it comes to hate crimes that are focused on women. And specifically, hate crimes online focused on women. And what could be done from a policy change perspective to make sure that it is that there are some really strong policy levers that can be triggered when this kind of thing happens, instead of relying on the person who is on the receiving end of that harassment and that hate to bring something forward. I think, creating a policy lever is something that we should definitely look at to make sure that generations after us don't have to struggle with this on their own. As Canadians, we have enshrined all kinds of values into policy and into programs. Healthcare is the one that we're most proud of. When we decided as a culture that this is something we wanted to make sure was available for all Canadians and future generations. So I think it exists. The policy levers exist. It's just a matter of making sure that we mobilize and enact them. And, just on that kind of online scrutiny that happens for women, I was listening to this really interesting podcast on the weekend that focused on a book called The Likeability Trap, and it focuses on women and leadership. And what the author wrote about was this double bind for women. So it seems that for men, that people will vote for a male candidate who they don't really like, but they believe is competent. But for women, the relationship between being likable and being competent is linked. So that women candidates are less likely to get votes if they are perceived as being not likable. So I think there's this double expectation for women, especially women in leadership positions, whether they're elected or even, women who run corporations, that there's this expectation that is different for women, and what we can do as a society to make sure that that is continually examined and then shifted.
I think, Sarah, you're bringing up a very interesting point. I was wondering with what you read and or with your own knowledge, because you speak about the expectations that people have. And here, the society still have different expectations when it comes to women looking at their career goals, their community goals, and then their personal ones, the expectation to maybe look after the children, the expectations to look after the elder, and in other areas of it. Can you speak to expectations maybe at the same time? So aside from the likability and the competency factor of it, are women having to carry the extra burden of more expectations on them?
So all the information and all the research that I have seen in terms of, expectations and the roles that women take on, it's shifted somewhat. There is, if we just look at the division of labor at home, so who's doing the cooking, the cleaning, and childcare, it's predominantly still females, women, who bear the responsibility for all of that stuff. And it's women then who have to often make the choices between career and family. I know that in the context of COVID-19, many women have been faced with the challenge of making that decision, and the long-term impact that has on their own well-being. Women who, are maybe pushed out of the labor market, then, in terms of their CPP or their future earnings, that has significant long-term impacts. But they are pushed into that decision because we lack those structural supports, like Diana said, childcare, transportation, all of the things that can support those women who have to make those difficult decisions. If we have supports that make it easier for them, it will mean a long-term positive impact on their well-being and their family's well-being, and by default, the community's well-being.
I appreciate that. You touched on talking about the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has had on women over the last 8 months. With an increased awareness of this issue, will more women consider actually now positions in public office because to basically address these inequities that are existing? Do you think this will drive people more on saying the cost is too high? Will it give us that extra push that we maybe not have seen for the last 10, 20 years? Carol, your thoughts on it?
I hate always having to defer to Diana, who can give her firsthand knowledge. What I'm noticing in the academic sphere, in the social media academic sphere, is that the experience of women during this pandemic has come to the fore because there have been some very outspoken female economists and social scientists, such as Brock's own Kate Bezanson. But there have been some female economists who have been very outspoken and have brought the numbers and said this is affecting women more than men. So, you see women driving this narrative now, very accomplished women driving this narrative. Will it now filter down to have women who are interested in running for public office? I don't know. I don't know. But I found it very interesting that it was women who are standing up and saying, we're finding these numbers. and it's impacting us, and it's impacting our sisters, our mothers, our kids. So that's who introduced that narrative in the first place, women academics.
Yeah, thank you so very much. Diana, and your take on it, will this pandemic actually in some roundabout way give us enough ammunition to move this forward and therefore get more people to saying, I need to be at this table, I need to ensure that the policies reflect the population as a whole and the needs of the population?
Well, I really hope so, but I feel like women are in survival mode right now, and it's hard to, you know, take advantage of those types of opportunities when you're just trying to make your home life work right now. So, but, you know, maybe what will drive women to participate more is reflecting on how we did respond to this, because if we look at the 2008-2009 recession, whether it was intentional or not, we did have a gendered response to that. That recession did impact men disproportionately in terms of men's employment. We focused on public infrastructure projects, which relies heavily on boosting the construction sector and employment in the construction employment field. That industry and that sector only has 11% employment of women across Canada. So that was a gendered response to recessionary pressures, whether we recognize it or not. So if we look at what's happening now with the pandemic and how it's disproportionately impacted women, and regard childcare as an economic policy, not as somebody's personal problem, then it can be a very effective tool to overcoming what we've seen happen to our economy and to our families and our communities. So I hope in the moment women can recognize, you know, that we need more voices to stand up for why these policies are important. But I hope it's not, you know, after we've moved on and didn't adopt the right policies to address the problems in front of us, that it motivates women to stand up and say, you know, I'm going to demand better, and if I have to put my name forward to do that, then that's how it's going to be.
And I think that also, Diana, to build on that, if we're looking at making sure that people who are already bearing the brunt of the, you know, the impact of shifts in the economy or whatever it is, then I think it's even more important for decision makers to be aware of those barriers and to make sure that there's lots of different ways to engage people who need to be engaged, and not just, you know, rely on what we've done in the past. Set a meeting at 2:30 in the afternoon and everybody come down to regional headquarters, for an example, right? I know that we've gotten a lot better at engaging in different ways, but you know, really paying attention to the ways that we invite people and making it easier for people. And I think that what's really interesting about the work that Carol did and I did as well was recognizing that municipal government has a huge impact on our day-to-day life. Like the 3 levels of government in Canada interact, you know, from federal to provincial and municipal, but our day-to-day, who's getting the roads cleared first, transportation, you know, the implementation of social programs, running of long-term care homes, there's lots in our day-to-day that in its operationalization is in the domain of municipal government. And so engaging at that level and other levels as well, but, you know, primarily the municipal level, I think really people understanding that that makes a huge difference in your day-to-day and how to get involved in that so that, you know, you're having a say and influencing what your day-to-day looks like.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to add, you know, I totally agree. Municipal government, it's underrated in terms of its importance on our everyday life, but it's also I would say the most accessible form of government to get to, you know, to try to get elected in. You don't need to get supported by a party. You don't also have to toe the line of that party. You don't need $100,000 to run a campaign. You put your name on the ballot and then you fight for why you're the best candidate. And it's from that perspective, it's very accessible. It's a great way for people who are wanting to start a career in politics or think they are interested in a career in politics to get started.
You know, it's an interesting point, both Diana, that you and Sarah brought up, because I look at it from all three levels of government and the cost of entering. You're absolutely right, Diana, because that is an issue for a lot of women entering other levels of government and pursuing those kind of positions that are there. So there's on one side, we've spoken about what can be done to support individuals to put their name on the ballot and to move forward in it. What are the hurdles? What are the barriers? What kind of supports do they need in moving forward? But there's the other aspect of it, and that has to do with voter awareness. The awareness that we need to see more of a balanced government, and here are the reasons for it. And this question goes to probably all three of you. Is there anything that you have seen that is out there that is really creating this awareness among voters to saying we need a more balanced representation than what we're seeing right now? And encouraging voters to look at it differently when they're making the choice, because especially at a municipal level, we have the choice of checking more than one box when it comes to that. And who is going to represent us at what level? Any thoughts on that? Carol, do you want to?
Voter awareness. I mean, I can only think that what might happen is, you know, female voters and male voters, they might see a response that, you know, is given to a certain policy, and they think, oh, that, you know, I don't want to stereotype, but, you know, I mean, I know there would be women out there that would see what the response would be to a certain policy by perhaps a male politician and say, well, that's ridiculous. A woman would never say that and would never think that. And it's time to start getting more women out there, right? So, I mean, eventually somebody is going to say, it's such an individual choice. I mean, I don't want to paint with such broad strokes, but I mean, at some point you think, you know what, okay, I've had enough. I need to get somebody else in there. But I mean, it's the whole merit-based argument as well, right? Just because you're female does not mean you're going to make a better politician, right? And we have females across the broad political spectrum, right? So that also has to be appreciated as well. Well, just because even though there is research out there on a global level that shows that the more female politicians that there are, the more improvements in the quality of life there is. So there is broad research to show that. But at this more focused level, you know, for every Andrea Horvath, you know, there's a Margaret Thatcher. So you're going to have that kind of back and forth. So I always think it's very it's dangerous to say, oh, you know, our voters going to be aware. Well, you're going to have some very progressively, you know, if you're a progressive-minded female and you have a progressive-minded male that's running, and, you know, perhaps a female candidate who does not share your view of the world, then you're going to vote, you know, for who shares your view of the world, whether they're female or male, right? So that's the dangerous line we walk when we talk about we need more women in politics, right? So I'll just be the caveat for the whole discussion. So I'm just throwing that out there and hand it off.
Appreciate it.
But I will say, you know, if you are aware of, you know, an intelligent woman who's dedicated to the community and you think she'd be great in a political role, then encourage her to run. Or if they are running, help support the campaign. And that doesn't have to be someone who is running in your riding. You can help support candidates who are in other ridings. And I think that, you know, building that support network is such an important factor for women who want to run, especially if they're new to politics and are maybe feeling a little not as confident as some of the more experienced people in politics. But so that is one easy thing that we can, you know, be more encouraging and supportive of getting women involved. Two, and this is harder, this is recognizing that you have something to offer in terms of taking on a leadership position and putting your name forward. But there's also a societal factor, I think, where we have to look at the way, you know, the idea of feminism, and stop treating feminism as a dirty word. Feminism is not about advancing women at the expense of men. Feminism is about creating equal opportunities for all. And I think when we start to embrace that idea of what that means and what that can mean for a society, it can really lead to a society that's more accepting, more inclusive, more empathetic. And who wouldn't want a society like that?
Right, and you know, and I also think in that same vein, I mean, all parties that were in party politics at the federal level, every party has their own recruitment program now to attract women into their party. So, so there, I think you're finding out it's very much based on strong women, accomplished women who would be good politicians, whether they're on the left of the spectrum or the right. So, I mean, I think you're seeing that movement in all three parties. It's not like this is a party specific thing or it's all happening on one side of the spectrum. So I think it's important exactly that when you see a woman that you know is accomplished, that could make a difference, to encourage them to participate. And as Diana said, I think a lot of the infrastructure around campaigning, women are not familiar with, and so they will need some help navigating the whole fundraising world, that type of thing, how to deal with media, how to deal with social media, that type of thing. Things that, you know, they may not be comfortable with or familiar with, and it's just a hurdle they need to learn how to get over, and then they can actually, you know, make a change.
From a business point of view, there have been greater demands on showing board representation, for example, to being more balanced. We're seeing more women actually in senior management roles. And there has been significantly studies done, and data shows that often those companies actually do better, financially perform better, from an HR perspective perform better, meaning that they have less of a staff turnover, staff satisfaction is greater, and innovation is happening at a greater speed. So there is a lot of support where we really can look at numbers, specific numbers where it has been tracked and looked at. And now my question would be, how do we do this when we look at public policy? How do we track there the success? So say we have a more gender balanced council that we have, are we expecting different policy outcomes? Sarah, what is your take on that?
I would say that there is some evidence to show that there are better policy outcomes. And Carol mentioned that in countries where they have achieved more gender parity, that the social determinants of health are rated quite high. And there are lots of different ways that countries are measuring the relationship between who is making the decisions and what life is like. I mean, even countries in developing nations like Zimbabwe, for example, who made it a special project to include more women on their government, have seen incredible strides in terms of the health and well-being of their communities. So I think that, again, going back to the example that I used, because for me, it's a real strong example. As Canadians, we decided healthcare was important. We enshrined that in policy, and now we see very good, on generally speaking, health outcomes for our population. We compare ourselves to other countries. So I think there is a relationship between who is making a decision and what outcomes we see, and there are lots of examples around the world where countries are measuring that.
Diana, if you would look at it on the local level, you're sitting at the regional council table, you have discussion. Do you think if there would be a gender equity at that council level, would you have different discussions? Would you have different priorities than what you're having right now?
Oh gosh, that's a tough question. I mean, it's hard to say, okay, stop everyone, we're going to apply gender lens to this conversation. I mean, what you really need to do there is just make sure that you have the right people at the table who can express those views and contribute that knowledge and experience. And that was why I brought forward the Women's Committee, because recognizing that structurally you can't mandate 50% women on regional council, as an example. It's up to the individual municipalities as to who they want to vote in. But that's where something like the Women's Committee can contribute, is that they can then be tasked with providing perspective input on policy, or helping bring issues that specifically have a gender lens to council for their consideration. So I'm hoping that something like that committee can help infuse some of our policy decision making with that important lens.
Makes sense. One of our attendees, there's actually a couple of them who have either via social media or texted us beforehand, is asking what impact would a national childcare program have on women considering public office? And I think it's a question that is often being raised. I know that we have kind of identified that it's one of a number of issues that are there, but how critical is that particular one for Niagara? I do not know who wants to take it, so I'm leaving Diana. You want to?
I've actually been speaking about this quite a bit lately. You know, participation in politics, I would equate to participation in the labor force. We know that if we were looking to Quebec as an example, they had upwards of 85% of women in participating in the workforce. In one cohort. So what we know is a national childcare strategy can provide childcare that's more accessible, it's more affordable, and allows for greater participation of women in the workforce. And I don't see you know, participation in office as that dissimilar from participating in the workforce. It's about, you know, having an opportunity in front of you that you want to take advantage of, and making sure that you have the resources that enable you to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. So I think, you know, childcare is such an important aspect of our social and public infrastructure, and we really need to give it credit as an economic policy, because it can have very many positive spillovers in terms of its economic impact.
That's there. If there's one question that has also come forward, which I thought was an interesting one, for us to realize the changes that we want to see, we speak to the importance of having equal representation. Should we ask of municipalities to basically put a rule in place and saying that for the next many years, it could be for the next election cycle or the cycle after that, that we should have a 50-50 representation or a 40-60 representation? Carol, Sarah, anyone on that thought? It was a question that has come forward.
That should be a goal.
It should be like a policy in place and saying that this is the commitment that this council is making on this particular issue, and we will move forward.
Okay. I don't think Canada has the political culture where a quota would work. Having said that, the countries that right now are showing to have the most gender equity are ones that originally did institute a quota. I'm thinking of Rwanda. Actually, right now is Rwanda, of all countries, is highlighted as the top country for gender representation on its national parliament. Canada ranks like 61st, the states are in the 70s. And so the countries that are excelling at this right now around the world are the ones who did initially have some type of quota, whether it was saying this many seats have to go to women, or we're requiring that of every party, they had a quota of candidates, right? So I think maybe, and you know, I think maybe there's parties in Canada that might have an unofficial quota when it comes to how many women they would like to run in elections. I think that might be a way to start changing the numbers. I don't think anybody would say, no, we need a hard quota on elected officials. I don't think anyone would argue that because I don't think there'd be a market for that. But I think that parties in particular should probably look to say, you know, we need to start, and they're starting to look to recruit more women, but I think they have to be a little bit more, show a little bit more effort and say, you know what, we're going to run this percentage of female candidates in our next election. And hopefully that will start to snowball.
Yeah.
And Mishka, sorry, I'm on kind of the opposite end from Carol.
Yeah,
As a policy, as a policy person, I think that what we enshrine in policy is what we measure and what we move to implement. So I think it may be, I agree with you 100% that the culture may not be ready and accepting of a quota system, but I think unless we have something that can withstand changes in who's in leadership positions in politics, so something enshrined in policy is, I think, the only way to truly match changes in culture to changes in outcome.
You know,
yeah, go ahead, Carol.
I was going to say, you know, and the whole snowball effect as well. One thing that the research does actually show is that when women see other women in positions of power, they do see themselves, they then can see themselves doing that, right? So, you know, the more they see women doing it themselves, they're like, you know, I can do that too. And they see that the door is open for them as well. So I don't think Sarah and I disagree so much, but yeah, we've had this discussion before about what is realistic in this country.
I'm having, actually, the last couple of minutes, we had about 4 questions coming in and we have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to try my best to get to them. And so let me start out with one of them. Rashmi Biswas is asking, and it's a great question. Good decision-making at all levels of government require access to quality data. What changes do you think we need to happen in regards to collecting gender-based data? And Carol, if I can ask you that maybe, and you have about 30 seconds to answer it, so we can the other 4 questions.
Sure. Now, you know, I'm not an economist, but I was looking for labor force data on women in Niagara specifically. We did a special report, and I was initially told by our partners at the Workforce Planning Board that they weren't going to be able to get that information. And then as this narrative of how COVID was affecting women, suddenly Stats Canada with their labor force data, then their next labor force data analysis for August, I think, suddenly had this gender lens. So, and that allowed now people, you know, the Workforce Planning Board to say, hey, I've just gotten access now. I can show you what's happening to women in Niagara, where that hadn't been available a few months earlier. So that's how data helps. And, you know, this type of awareness and pushing that narrative and saying, no, you know, we need information on this. And the information is there a lot of the time. And asking people in the community who are doing data collection, and, you know, Mishka, you know who there is in Niagara that does this, say, no, we need some questions that break it down this way.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's some really interesting work that some groups have done where actually they're looking at municipal levels too and asking them the question, who benefits from this policy, who doesn't, and to track some of that information as well in data beyond of the workforce that is there. Emily Kovacs is actually had, first of all, we need equity, she's saying, in general enshrined in strategic planning for all levels of government, and measurable KPIs attached to these are the way to do it. So Sarah, there is someone who strongly agreed with you. And Emily is with Niagara Folk Arts, and she also said the question of intersectionality of representation of women is also critically important, especially when we look at newcomer and women and how to incorporate them into politics. And I think it's a very, very important point that she has. Holly Mandula with Meridian Credit Union is asking, does the national childcare strategy have any focus on childcare during non-standard hours? And that's a big issue for Niagara. Standard hours are your 9 to 5, but when we take a look at our jobs, a lot of them are 24 hours. They're evenings in accommodation, retail services, and food services that are there. Any thoughts on that aspect of it? Sarah, maybe if I can ask you to speak to that.
Yeah,
it's crucially, sorry, go ahead, Carol.
Oh, no, I was going to say that's actually an issue I was going to bring up because as women push this need for a national daycare program to the forefront, I mean, just to have anything would be great. When I came through the workforce, I had one of those kind of off-hour jobs, and you know, I couldn't afford to put my kids in childcare because I wasn't going to be working during the hours they were open anyways, and they weren't available when I was working. So, you know, it's one of those wicked problems. I'll hand it off to Diana. I mean, what are you reading up on this? Because I know this is your area right now.
Well, I mean, any national childcare program would have to take into account before and after care. It's an important part of the conversation, and just goes back to that idea of, you know, how accessible is childcare, how affordable is childcare, because depending on where you live in Canada, that it can be very different. And I spoke to the Quebec model. They pay on average $175 a month for childcare. And in Ontario, we pay anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 a month, depending on where you live. So it is very expensive. And if we want women to be able to participate in the workforce, we need to make it accessible and affordable, and also quality. We want to make sure that our kids are getting quality care that emphasizes an early learning model, not just a child minding model.
Right. I don't like it when people, you know, mention, because when I mentioned my own workforce experience, saying, well, you could always find a household or a mother who would watch your kids for, you know, the 2 to 3 hour overlap before, you know, your husband got home. That's not really what I was looking for. I mean, sure, I guess I could,
Yeah.
but that to me is, you know,
well, the larger point is it shouldn't be unaffordable to work because you have children.
Right. And you shouldn't have to do a piecemeal, right? I'm going to put my kids here for the day because I need the final 2 hours that they're open before either their grandparents or my husband can get home to pick them up, right? And you have, like, in the end, 3 or 4 caregivers trying to piece it all together. And you're still paying, as you said, Diana, a couple $1,000s a month for that privilege, right?
And Sarah, I'm conscious of the time. Sarah, you wanted to get into the conversation, I think, at one point when we talked about the hours of childcare, for some closing comments from you on it.
Yeah, well, it goes back to, you know, one of the germane questions behind the paper, which is who is benefiting? So if we have a labor force that could be increased in terms of their participation by more flexible hours, overnight care, childcare, then that's what we need to be advocating for, and asking the question, who's benefiting from the current system, and what do we need to do to make sure that our intended beneficiaries are in fact supported by the investments we're making in public programs and public policy.
I'm conscious of the time. Thank you very much, Sarah. We always try to keep it right within the hour, but I'm right now at this point seeing that we really could have at least another hour or two on this topic. And what it really speaks to is that we have to ensure that further dialogue is taking place and is taking place in the community. I wanted to just, before I'm wrapping up, just draw your attention to a couple of groups that are existing, that are there, that I really encourage participants to reach out to. So one of them is WIN, the Women in Niagara. It's a GNCC council, and we'll provide you with all the contact information. They're committed to ensuring and supporting women in business and as well in public roles. There is a Facebook group called the Niagara Women in Politics, and if you're on Facebook, engage with them. If you're interested in being a candidate for a political position that is there. There is the Gender Equity Task Force as well. You can find them, and we will provide you contact information for all of those groups. And the Niagara Region's Women's Advisory Committee is another one that is also closely looking at a lot of the issues that we talked about this morning. So my thanks, and the thanks from my team behind the scenes to Carol, Sarah, and Diana for being with us this morning. It's been a great dialogue, and one that we could that we have to have again. This particular webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website and throughout our social media and the channels in the upcoming days. To all the participants, thank you so very much for joining us, and please stay in touch on this very important issue. So thank you for being with us this morning.